Hi, I'm Lynn Cornell, and welcome to Journey Through the Bible Verse by Verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study through each book of the Bible, verse by verse and chapter by chapter. Now, I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're reading from a different Bible translation, the read is different, the message is the same. We're going to continue in our study through the 24th chapter of Matthew, and we're going to pick it up in verse 23. Now, we have answered the first question. Or Jesus has answered the first question. Remember, he had predicted the destruction of Israel. The disciples came to him and asked him, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So those are the three questions that we're dealing with in this chapter. So now, question number 2, when will be the sign of your coming? And that's the question here. He had just talked about, of course, the world, the world and the day of grace in which God is speaking, meaning the gospel. You know, people oftentimes saying, what is God saying in all of the world trouble? Well, he's been saying it, and he's going to continue to say it to the end of the age. The gospel message. During that time, the gospel will be preached. The people of God will suffer persecution. And then the objective from God's perspective is that the gospel will be preached in all the world, and then the end of the world will come. That will follow a day of the Lord, or a day of wrath, in which God will then judge the world for rejecting his Messiah, judge the world for their sins, their rebellion. And one of the things that's going to happen to the people of Israel is that God is going to judge Israel. And we talked about the 70 weeks that are determined, the 70 sets of 7-year period of time that began, in other words, the clock began with the issuing of King Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. Prophetically, we now know that we are between week 69 and week 70. That's where we are prophetically right now. We know that because in the 70th week was the week when the man of sin, the beast, the Antichrist, will go into the temple of God, demand to be worshipped as God, and will begin a holocaust against the Jewish people. That is the abomination that makes desolate. In other words, the abomination is he's going to declare himself as God and demand to be worshipped. When people refuse, the Jews refuse, he's going to then begin a destruction. That is, so we know that hasn't happened yet. So the 70 weeks then will conclude with that event. And so then he says, when that ends, okay, now this is where we're at here, how he's going to, what happens after all of that. Again, just a snapshot, not meant to be in depth with this chapter here. But when we get into the book of Daniel, we will get into some in-depth things. And other books, Revelations, the book of Zechariah, a whole lot of stuff. Now, verse 23. So this is the second question. When will be the sign of your coming? So after all of that, then Jesus is going to come. After the end of man's time is when Jesus is going to come. And by the way, the second coming is Jesus bodily coming to the earth. He's not going to come figuratively. He's not going to come in the spirit. He's going to come bodily. He's going to set up a kingdom, and he will rule for 1,000 years. Okay. That's what's going to happen now, but this is the sign of it. So verse 23, if anyone tells you, then look, here is the Messiah, or over here, do not believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Now again, the elect here is the Jewish people, the Jewish believers, probably more specific. Take note, I have told you in advance. So if they tell you, look, he is in the wilderness, don't go out. Look, he is in the inner rooms, don't believe it. Let me stop for a moment, because we see this even today, that there are people who proclaim Jesus is coming, that Jesus is out in the field, or he's in a church. So people get the idea that let me quit my job, so empty my bank accounts and give it to the church, and we're going to live communally and wait for Jesus. He says, no, didn't happen. And by the way, it always ends badly for those people. Verse 27, for as the lightning comes out of the east and flashes as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will be gathered. Okay. Now, this is the sign of the coming of the Son of Man, by the way. This is the sign. Okay. And there will be no mistaking the coming of Jesus. In 1914, the Jehovah Witness prophesied that, actually they prophesied in 1914 that Jesus would come back. And when he failed to come back in 1914, they do like other false teachers and prophets. They shift the goalposts. And what they said was Jesus came in the Spirit. Well, notice he said Jesus, there's no in the Spirit. He's going to come. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes towards the west, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. Okay. Now, verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, we just talked about that tribulation of those days. That is the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, in which the abomination that makes desolation takes place. Okay, so immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun would be darkened, the moon would not shed its light, the stars would fall from the sky, and the celestial powers would be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels and with a loud trumpet, and will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, again, this is to be understood in light of the gathering the people of Israel. Okay? I mean, he's talking to Israel right here. Again, how do we know that Jesus hasn't come yet? Because these great signs, these visible signs haven't happened. Okay? They haven't happened. All right, verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. And as soon as its branches become tender and sprout leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, recognize he is near at the door. I assure you this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. Now, the fig tree, you said the parable of the fig tree. If you were locked away, let's say you had some type of condition and you were locked away, isolated in a hospital room, but you had a window, you had a view. Okay? So but you could never go outside, but you could view outside. You was there year round. Okay? How would you know that summer was approaching? Because you could observe the tree. Right? You would know that winter happened because the leaves would fall off the tree. And then as you would observe, out your window, you wouldn't necessarily feel the warm air or the cold air. But you would know springtime was near because the trees would begin to what? Sprout leaves. And when they would sprout leaves, you would say, summer's coming. Now, Jesus gives us that with the fig tree. When you see those signs, that lets you know summer is coming. Now, there has been an erroneous interpretation to this. And that I could, for the life of me, I cannot, well, put it like this, I don't understand how they arrived at that. And that is this. People interpret that the fig tree means that when Israel becomes a nation again, which means this, that when Israel became a nation in 1948, then that meant summer was coming. That also meant that in verse 34, he said, I assure you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Well, a generation, again, another erroneous interpretation or meaning, and that is that a generation is 40 years. Now, on both accounts, I don't know where they get that from, period. I've read scriptures and I cannot, for the life of me, say, how did anyone come up with the fact that a generation was 40 years, and then, of course, that Israel was the fig tree with Israel. So what happened was that in 1948, when when Israel became a nation, people began to count. Well, 1948, generation, right? 1988, Jesus is coming. Well, as you all are now witnessing, we are well past 1988, Jesus didn't come. Erroneous interpretations. He is referring again prophetically. What were the signs? Well, he's been telling us. One sign, think about this, the abomination that makes desolate. When you see that, he says, when you see that, remember and Jesus used those words, when you see this, first of all, run. But when you begin to see all of these prophetic signs come to pass, so that one particular, then you know that generation will not pass away. That's the generation you know that won't pass away. We know the end is near. I mean, in other words, not the end so much as Jesus approaching. Jesus coming is near. In fact, when you see the abomination that makes desolate, you know 3.5 years, you know that the tribulation period is going to come to an end. Now we're going to get into the more details about that in the next video, because in verse 36, Jesus is going to even clarify even more. So we'll stop here and we'll pick up at verse 36 in the next video. We'll see you then.